Okay, everybody, we're about to start again. Hopefully everything goes according to plan. So, having set the scene, I'm going to give you the first session, which, as it should be, is looking at BEHÇET'S from a global perspective, but I've only got 15 minutes, so that's a bit tricky, isn't it? But hopefully what you'll find I'm presenting to you about this morning will also link in with what I'm about to say later on in the afternoon. Okay? So first of all, I'll nail my colours to the mast, and I say, basically, is it a disease or a syndrome? And I'm firmly in the syndrome camp. And I noticed that appeared in the newsletter recently that Ali Jawad from the London Centre wrote an article on that. So there's a bit of philosophical discussion about this, but basically, as we'll see later, our genetic technology is enabling us to, at least for some of the syndrome of BEHÇET'S, to dissect out those. And we'll hear later on from Eslam Al-Abadi how that relates to children who get BEHÇET'S. But this slide really summarises some of that discussion. And you'll see that diseases and syndromes are disease constructs, and they have to fulfill these two criteria at the bottom to enable doctors, and for that matter, patients, to understand about their disease and how it will affect them in the future. So give us an understanding of that. And actually, they're only going to be useful if they give us some insight into the natural history and guide treatment decisions. Okay? So this slide summarizes the principles behind the syndrome to disease spectrum discussion. And as you'll see, it can't be classified as a disease until a precise causal mechanism has been clearly defined. And I think the jury is out for that with BEHÇET'S at the moment. We understand BEHÇET'S as mostly a polygenic disorder, a syndrome, for which there is no precise causal mechanism. Although you'll see again from my talk that there is this concept that's emerged called the MHC class 1 opathy concept. And I'll explain a little bit about that more later on. And you'll hear about monogenic mimics from Eslam Al-Abadi. So I gave a lot of thoughts as to what I should say in this meeting, since I only have 15 minutes. So I choose to use international data to try and address these three questions. That's number one question: why did I get it? How could I pass it on? And how will it affect me in the future? Okay. So let's look at the first question. And I'm going to use some data from South Korea. Because the team in South Korea did a national population-based study to look at the familial incidence and risk for getting BEHÇET'S. And the headline message is that they did find a familial risk for getting BEHÇET'S, but also revealed a prominent role, as always, for gene-environment interactions that we were discussing about earlier on. So in the context of South Korea, this slide really shows you how the country as a whole has rapidly transformed itself over a fairly short period of time, and the country's become more wealthy. So that slide shows the line going up for GDP and expressed similarly for per capita of the population. And obviously, that's had a big impact for the society overall and also for individuals. And one of the things that yellow bar shows you, during that period, they measured a massive fall in the number of cases with BEHÇET'S syndrome over that period of about 80%. So what was the reason for that? And they speculated that because South Korea was a fairly genetically homogeneous population with not much migration, that this could be due to environmental factors such as changes in infection, hygiene, or socio-economics in some way. But all of these things would interact in this so-called genome-environment interaction. So let's delve into the detail a little bit more. Now, the advantage in South Korea is that the collection of data is mandatory. There is no opting out. It just has to happen. They have a 50 million population, and data on diagnoses are collected, and they're medically confirmed for BEHÇET'S twice. And what they also do is they collect family histories for their patients as well. So they have what we call kinship information. And what they found in the study, first of all, was that the prevalence of Behçet's syndrome in the population was 26 per 100,000 of the population. And that, as you'll hear later on, is roughly, well, a bit more than twice as much as we have in the UK at least. And the incidence was 1.5 per 100,000 of the population. So from a cohort of the population of 50 million, they found a cohort of 22 million people that they could follow between 2002 and 2017 for the occurrence of Behçet's for the first time. They found 31,000 patients who had Behçet's in the country as a whole, more women than men, as you can see. 8,000 of them were fathers, 15,800 were mothers, 2,500 sons, and 4,554 daughters. And they were able to work out the risk of getting Behçet's syndrome. And this is the data that summarizes what they found. So, first of all, 53,000 individuals had affected first-degree relatives with Behçet's syndrome, and they found 284 familial cases who developed Behçet's. There's more than one case of Behçet's in that family. And it's important to note that overall, that's 4% of the familial cases compared to the number of cases that had Behçet's overall in the population. So it's a small proportion to start with, okay? And then what they did is they worked out the familial risk. So if you look at the bottom number there, where it says no family history of Behçet's, there was a large number of individuals who had no family history, and 0.22 per 100,000 person years got Behçet's, okay? And they classified that as 1 so that we compare all the other examples going up the slide with that number so that we can work out the relative risk of a person having Behçet's. And what you can see is if you've got a positive family history of Behçet's, you've developed it in the family, then we've measured an increase in risk of 15 times compared to the normal population, okay? If you have more than one first-degree relative affected, you can see it goes up massively to 163 times. So that shows you how powerful that genetic risk is. Similarly, for an affected twin, an affected sibling was, again, relative risk of 15 times increased over baseline. And if you have an affected father or mother, the risk of it being passed on was 13 times more than it should have been if it shouldn't be passed on genetically. So that gives you a handle of the overall genetics. So what they found from that study was, first of all, that the genetic component of Behçet's from families was overall quite a small proportion of all the cases that were occurring sporadically overall, okay? But what they found was that there was an increasing magnitude of familial risk with increasing degree of genetic similarity amongst the first-degree relatives, which is what we would expect. Having more than one affected first-degree relative significantly increased the risks. But one of the things I also found was that it was far more common in women than it was in men, even though, as you can see from the previous slide, the risk of passing it on was the same for men and women. So these authors took all this information into account and concluded that apart from the genetic factors, there were very powerful genome environmental interactions going on that accounted for that difference. What they could be, we don't know. So going back to our question, yes, there is a genetic component that increases the risk of passing it on by a factor of 13, whether you're a father or a mother with Behçet's. In absolute risk, that risk is actually very small. But something odd is also happening to explain the higher incidence and prevalence in women compared to men, and also the unexplained cases of Behçet's that develop it without that family history. So they again speculate that there's a powerful genome environmental interaction going on, and this must be operating during childhood to influence the cases that don't get Behçet's. So what are those factors? So something's funny is going on. So that leads me on to the next bit of the talk, which is something that we see in clinic all the time, and I referred to earlier on. And on the right-hand side of that slide, you'll see all of the elements of what we call the so-called BEHÇET'S phenotype, okay, though the individual elements. And then on the left-hand side of the slide, you see the Venn diagram, and you see some clusters of features of BEHÇET'S that tend to group together more than we would expect by chance if it was a completely random process. So, for example, more patients get mucocutaneous symptoms, mouth ulcers, genital ulcers, and arthritis, and lumps on the legs called erythema and that's much more common in women than it is in men. Then there's a vascular and a GI cluster, and an ocular and a neuro cluster. So why do these things go together like that? And we really don't truly understand the mechanism for that. So I'm going to share with you some data now from, again, another country, Japan, which also is a fairly homogeneous country from the genetic perspective, with little in the way of migration, the population stable over time. And what we found from this paper here, reported here, was from two cohorts, a Yokohama University cohort, and then the Japanese Ministry of Health and Labour Welfare database, which they have in their country to collect all the new cases with Behçet's syndrome. And what they found was that things were changing over time. They found roughly similar results in these two cohorts, but they found that the proportion of the patients in the cluster who had the gastrointestinal manifestations and women, that tended to be increasing over time from 18.5% to 28%. And that there was a change in the cluster amongst the patients who had eye disease with relatively milder ocular involvement. And so again, that led them to speculate that there was something weird going on, and there was an environmental process that we don't know of that was influencing this. And they speculated that it could be something to do with the changes in the country moving toward a more Western style of diet and Westernized lifestyle. So that remains to be proven, but that's interesting to think about that. And obviously all of these gene environment interactions that could occur, that could account for this, are explainable through so-called epigenetic mechanisms. That's the way that the environment influences our genomes. And we now know that these mechanisms can be heritable as well, so they can be passed on. So here's another study along those lines, reported at last year's International Behçet's meeting, which more or less found the same thing in another Japanese cohort, again showing on the right that Group B, which is the group that had vascular or intestinal involvement, was increasing over time. And why is that? And I've put on the left a slide that shows the frequency of gastrointestinal involvement in patients with Behçet's in different parts of the globe. And you'll see that it isn't the same in all places. So it's more common in the West, UK, America. It's also appearing to be more common in Japan. But in the Middle East, it's less common. So they don't see so much of that. So what is the mechanism of that? And are there important environmental factors that we don't yet understand that are influencing this expression of the syndrome? So let's now quickly look at genome environmental interactions, which are thought to operate, as I said, through modifiable epigenetic or gene regulatory mechanisms. But they are heritable, so they can be passed on. So these could be important factors in relation to the difference between populations that I've shown you already, and also might explain why one child in a family might get Behçet's with a family history of Behçet's, but another might not. Okay, so is there anything we can learn about that from the literature? So I'm putting up one slide here that is providing a tantalizing glimpse to the answer for that question. But unfortunately, because we don't have the detailed registry data that they have in South Korea or Japan, we can't answer this question directly in the UK for Behçet's. So I've taken the inflammatory bowel disease literature instead, okay, because this is a condition that is similar in some respects to Behçet's. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that there are a panel of lines, and essentially what these investigators did is they looked at families who had a family history of Behçet's within their family, and that's all the data on the left-hand side. And they also compared families with a history of inflammatory bowel disease with those families that don't have a family history of inflammatory bowel disease. And that's the right-hand panel. And then what they did is they connected that information with all the epidemiological information that they had about those patients' past history and experience during childhood and in their electronic health records in this Danish Patients Register for Inflammatory Bowel Disease. And there were two things that they found. The first thing was that it seemed to be that patients with a history of ankylosing spondylitis in their family were more likely to get inflammatory bowel disease than those who didn't have that history. So that's something completely unrelated to inflammatory bowel disease that seems to be influencing the risk. And as you'll hear about later on, that links in with what I was saying about this so-called MHC class 1-opathy concept, because ankylosing spondylitis is part of that group. So that was interesting. But the most interesting thing was they looked at their antibiotic exposure and infection history going back right into childhood. And what they found was that there were two signals that came out from that. And what it showed was that if you'd been treated with antibiotics during childhood, especially if you'd been given broad spectrum antibiotics during childhood, then that modulated your risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease in your sibling. Okay? So it's one of the determining factors that seems to modulate that risk. And they found that both in the families who had a family history of inflammatory bowel disease, but also in comparing the families with a family history of inflammatory bowel disease with those that weren't. And that I won't point to them because I've got to go away from the microphone, but that came out as a consistent pattern. So what is that telling us? What's driving that? So summing up all of this information that we've heard, genetic determinants are the predominant drivers for familial aggregation of Behçet's syndrome, and we've been able to quantify the risk of that in South Korea. It will be different in England, but we could potentially and conceivably do that with a proper registry. There's more cases in women than in men, and that appears to be a phenomenon that's emerging in Japan, present in the West, but not recorded in the Middle East. Why is that? Is there an environmental factor? What is the effect of sex on the propensity to developing Behçet's, and does that somehow interact with these environmental factors? We've seen that there are differences in frequencies of the gastrointestinal or gut involvement, depending on which part of the planet you are when you develop Behçet's. Again, could that be something to do with environment, socioeconomic factors, infection history, or exposure? We need to find out. And then when we deep dive into the genome-environment interaction, we find these two signals of the so-called MHC class 1-opathy link, the ankylosing spondylitis link, the impact of deprivation as a socioeconomic factor, and then clues from the Danish registry for the role of antibiotics. Could that be influencing either the microbiome, or could it be modulating the gut microbes in some way that then changes the risk of developing inflammatory bowel disease? And obviously that's possibly a concept that could be transferable to the concept of Behçet's syndrome overall. So I've now finished my section, and I think it's the time for my son to give his presentation. Has he logged on, or? So we're going to go to the recording. Okay. So there must be some technical problem. You'll set that up. Yeah. So just to give a background to Daniel, who is my son. He lives in America, and he's been working in the field of artificial intelligence, first for Google, and then now for another company where he's the head for machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I've had many interesting conversations with him over the years about this, and I'm sure they'll continue. So I've asked him to give us an insight into how these things work, deep learning, neural networks, and so forth. So hopefully he'll give you an understanding of that, and maybe he'll be available later on.
I'm giving a talk today titled Getting Familiar with Artificial Intelligence. So a bit of background on me. I work as the head of machine learning at a company called Impulse. We're a software company that builds tools to help developers create AI. And I've also written a couple of technical books on AI and machine learning. As you might have noticed from the name, Dr. Situnayake is my dad, and he asked if I could come and give a talk today to all of you about AI and machine learning and what those are, just a basic introduction. So the real first question is, what is artificial intelligence? But I don't think you can really answer that question without answering a kind of even more basic question to begin with, which is, what is intelligence? And it turns out this is actually quite a big question and quite hard to answer. It's the kind of thing that philosophers debate over. But we can probably come up with some basic answers to help guide our discussion. So I'd say intelligence involves understanding what is going on in a situation. It also involves predicting what might happen next, having some kind of expectation about what follows from one thing to another. It's also about knowing the right thing to do in a given moment. And there are many, many other things that are part of intelligence. But I think these first three are kind of key for what we want to talk about today. So if we start talking about what is artificial intelligence, well, really, it's just doing all this other stuff using a computer. So can we make a computer program that can understand what's going on in a situation, predict what might happen next, or know the right thing to do? If we can do that, then we can create something that is, justifies the name artificial intelligence. So here are some examples of artificial intelligence. One of my favorites is a robot vacuum. So these little things, they're really cool. You just set them off around your house and they'll roll around on their little wheels and vacuum your floor. And they're smart enough using artificial intelligence to navigate around your house. They can figure out where they are. They've got cameras and other sensors, and they can make sure they vacuum the whole floor, and then they go back to their little home base at the end and charge their battery. So that's a really nice example of AI. I think everybody always thinks of robots and AI together. But another thing that's been in the news a lot recently around AI is the idea of chatbots, ChatGPT, for example, and AI assistants. So these are computer programs where you can have a conversation with them and they can try and reply to your conversation and help you out or give you information in some way. So they're using AI to create convincing replies to your questions. Another example of AI that you use every day, maybe without realizing, is search engines. So companies like Google, they have big teams working on AI, and they use AI behind the scenes to decide which websites are the best match for your query. So if you're writing a question about where you'd like to go on holiday, the sites that get shown are going to have been chosen in some respect by AI. There'll be AI involved in figuring out which of the millions of websites out there are the ones that should appear at the top of the list. There's also a lot of use of AI in modern business software. So if you work in business, you may use AI in your software to help you analyze the complex statistics that come out of running a really large business, for example. Same with any kind of technical software these days. There's a lot of use of AI to help understand the huge amounts of numbers that we generate on a day-to-day basis. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how AI works. So AI is basically made up of computer programs called algorithms. And some algorithms are really simple. So I picked a super simple example here, which is a thermostat in your house. So you set the temperature you want, and the thermostat will turn on your heater until it gets to that temperature. And then it will turn off your heater when it gets there. So the algorithm inside a thermostat is very simple. There's some code here. It doesn't matter if you don't understand that. The concept is just that you look at what the temperature is right now, and then you look at what temperature you want to switch on the heater, and you only switch on the heater while the temperature is lower than that. So if the temperature is less than 18 degrees, you will switch on the heater. If the temperature gets higher than 18 degrees, then you switch it off. That's an algorithm. Even though it's super simple, it's still an algorithm. That's kind of the most basic that they get. But there's a little bit of intelligence there, right? There's something about knowing the right thing to do. When the temperature gets below 18 degrees, we'll switch on the heater. That's a little bit of intelligence captured in some computer code. That's an AI algorithm, essentially. It's the simplest you're going to find. But there are also some very complex algorithms out there. And for example, our little robot vacuum there has a ton of different AI algorithms being used within its code that are helping it navigate around a house and clean the floor and not go over the same patch twice and find its way back to its charger at the end of cleaning. So some of these systems could be very, very complicated. And in fact, some of them can be really hard to make. So that's what we're going to talk about next. How do you create algorithms? So algorithms are generally created by a computer programmer or a mathematician. They're a pretty well understood thing. They've been around for thousands and thousands of years. Some are very easy to create, like the example we gave earlier with the thermostat. But others, like the robot vacuum, are very complex and require lots of knowledge and fine-tuning. So maybe lots of mathematical knowledge, maybe lots of time spent making sure the algorithm handles all of the different cases that can happen. Many algorithms are so complex that they'd be impossible to create by hand. So even if you're an expert programmer or a master mathematician, it's so complicated you wouldn't be able to sit down and come up with it. It's just too much. And there's a good example here. So here's our nice easy algorithm where if the temperature is less than 18 degrees, then we switch on the heater. Inside of our thermostat, that's the algorithm that's running. Another way to look at that would be, imagine if we had a camera instead of our thermometer in the thermostat. Imagine we had a camera looking outside at the street. And we're trying to say, if it looks cold outside, let's turn on the heater. So that sounds simple to a human being like us. You look outside and you can see, oh, it's snowy. There's snow on the ground. There's snow falling through the air. That looks pretty cold. I know those things don't happen unless it's cold. So maybe we should switch on the heater. But if we were trying to train an algorithm to do it, it's really, really complicated. This picture, it's a whole bunch of pixels. How do you figure out from that whether it's hot or cold? How do you describe to the computer what snow is and whether it means that something's going to be hot or cold? That's something that's actually really, really hard to do. And you struggle to sit down and create an algorithm that can reliably do that by hand. So this is where something called machine learning comes in. And machine learning is a term you often hear in conjunction with AI. And it sounds kind of magical, you know, a machine. How can a machine learn? But it's actually quite simple. And I'm going to explain the basics to you today. So it's essentially a way to create algorithms automatically. So instead of going in and doing all the programming by hand, you have the computer do some of it for you. So instead of writing an algorithm by writing computer code, you actually collect data about a situation. And we'll see more of that in a second. You then train the machine learning model to make sense of it. So the model is just a term we use in machine learning to mean the algorithm that we're going to be training. So as an example here, I've got a lot of pictures that I've collected of cold. So if you look at any of these pictures as a person, you can see, oh, that looks a bit chilly. We've got a snowman, we've got some snowy fields. All of these represent what we think of as cold weather. So if you saw this out of the window, you might turn the heater on. On the other hand, we've got a few pictures of some warm weather. So we've got the desert there, we've got a tropical island, some palm trees, some nice flowers in a sunny field. And these all represent warm. So this is my data. Each one of these pictures is a piece of data that I can use to train my machine learning algorithm. So let's see how that works. So I start out with this ML model, and to begin with, it's untrained. It's basically dumb. It doesn't know anything. And the first thing we do is feed in a bit of data. So first, we're going to feed in this picture of a sunny flower on a sunny day, and we'll ask the machine learning model, is this representing a warm day or a cold day? And to begin with, it doesn't really have any way of knowing that. It just kind of randomly gives a result. So let's say it gives a result that, hey, this looks like a warm day. So we actually know that that's correct. So well done, ML model. Even though you're not trained, you got the right answer, basically by luck. So in the next example, we're going to feed in a different image. So we'll feed in an image of this snowman on a really snowy day. We feed that into this ML model. And remember, the model's untrained. It doesn't have any clue about anything. And it's still telling us it's a warm day. Clearly, this is not a warm day. Otherwise, the snowman would have melted. So we know that the model got it wrong. So this is where the training comes in. So what we do now, because we know the model got this wrong, we're going to adjust the model very slightly so that next time this image gets fed in, or one that's quite similar to it, it will give the right answer. So we're telling the model, hey, you got this wrong. We're going to change you very slightly so that next time you see this image, maybe you'll get it right. So we then do this same process millions of times. We feed in all of our images and we take a look at what comes out of the model. And if it's wrong, we tweak the model very slightly and then we do it again. And once you've done that millions of times with lots of data, the model learns to give you the right result. So now if we put in an image of a snowman in the snow, or even an image that's not exactly the same but is similar, the model should be able to tell us that, hey, this looks like a cold day. And that's basically how machine learning works. There are more complex models. There are all sorts of different types of models for different types of data. There are some for images. There are some for just time series values. There are all sorts of different kinds of models, but they all kind of work like that. You basically feed in the data and then you adjust the model each time so that it gets a little better. And after a lot of repetition, it will figure out what you're trying to tell it. So an AI system is built out of lots of different algorithms, usually. So you might have some machine learning algorithms, you might have other types of algorithms, and they'll all be connected together. So in our little robot vacuum, for example, it's not that it has one algorithm or one machine learning model in there. There'll be a lot of different little pieces that are all working together to help the robot do the correct thing. And as a system, you feed in inputs and it will give you an output. So for the little robot, it has cameras and sensors attached. Those are the inputs. And the output is, how does it steer itself around? How does it move? And working together, all these different algorithms allow the little robot to navigate around your house. So there are some big benefits to AI and machine learning. And the primary benefit is that computers are really fast and efficient at repetitive tasks. So if we train our little robot to be able to vacuum our house, that saves us time. We don't have to worry about doing that ourselves. And there are lots of other tasks that are repetitive that we can use AI and machine learning to do for us. Machine learning can also help us find hidden patterns in super complex data. So we showed the example of those images. It would have been very hard to write an algorithm by hand that can determine which category it is, cold day or a hot day. But using machine learning, we find those hidden patterns in the images, and we end up with a model that can represent these patterns for us, and we can use it to make predictions. But there are some big drawbacks of AI and machine learning. So one of them is that in order to work, you need lots of data, and it can't just be any data. It has to be high quality data. So that means that, if you have the hot and cold weather, you have to make sure that all the pictures of hot weather are actually hot weather and all the pictures of cold weather are actually cold weather. If there's some messiness there and some of them are wrongly labeled as hot or cold, the model won't be able to learn very well. And if you only have a few images, it won't learn very well either. You need to have lots. Once you've trained your model, it can be quite hard to understand how it actually works. You can measure that it works. You can say, okay, 90% of the time it's getting it right. But it's hard to know how it's working and why it's getting it right. And that can be difficult if you need to have a good explanation of how the thing is working. Another big thing is that AI systems lack common sense. Because these are just algorithms that have been trained on a computer, they only have a little sort of narrow view of the world, and they can't really understand what's going on. So I'll show you a good example of that. We trained our model there on a picture of a palm tree on a beach. It looks very nice and hot and sunny. So maybe our model starts to learn like, oh, if I see a palm tree, that means it's a hot day because palm trees are in hot places. So it must be hot outside. However, you could just as easily get a picture here of some palm trees with some snow. And if we fed this into the model and the model was looking for palm trees and the model says, hey, there's a palm tree, that means this is a hot day. Well, sadly, that's wrong. Here we got some palm trees in the snow. So that's a good example of how the model doesn't have common sense. It's not necessarily going to be able to figure out what's going on based on the data that it's been shown during training. So some final thoughts about AI. Really, AI is just a helpful tool for understanding data and for automating repetitive tasks. It allows us to get a little bit of insight about some data, and it can do that very quickly and very cheaply. AI has already led to lots of real benefits across the board in all sorts of industries and use cases. It's a real tool. It's been around for quite a long time, and it can be very effective. But it isn't a magic wand. You can't just apply AI to something and magically figure it out. It's another tool that experts have to use to build systems that actually do real work. One thing to think about right now, there's so much hype about AI. You hear it in the news all the time. People are always talking about AI. And this is really common when there's a new technology. And there's actually this thing called the Gartner hype cycle, which describes how people talk about technology over time. And when a new technology appears, so recently we've had a lot of this stuff called generative AI, which is like the AI chatbots, things like ChatGPT. When something new like that arrives, it's very impressive and it gets written about a lot and people get very excited. And it goes through this big peak in expectations. People think, wow, this is so cool. It's so exciting. It's going to change the world. And you end up with this peak of inflated expectations where the reality of the technology doesn't quite match up to what it can really do. And then after realizing that, people start to get a bit disappointed. And we're around there now. You're starting to see articles that are like, hey, AI actually isn't that great. It doesn't work that well in lots of situations. Why is everyone getting so excited about AI in the first place? And then you go through the trough of disillusionment where everyone's really down on it, like, oh, AI, that's a flash in the pan. We thought it was going to revolutionize the world, and it turned out to be nothing. But then after that, when people start to really build useful stuff and people see the impact of the technology on their lives, you get into this plateau of productivity where we see, hey, yeah, this is a real technology. It has uses. It can be applied to problems and help solve problems, but it's not going to cure every problem in the world. And that just happens naturally over time with every technology. And where we are with AI right now is about where I drew that star. So people got very, very excited about it over the last year. We've started to see that draw down a little bit, and there's a bit more kind of realism coming in. Soon there'll be a bit of kind of despair of like, oh, wow, this is really not working the way we thought. But after that, eventually we'll get to a point where everyone's just sort of board, really, and we're not talking about AI all the time, but it's become another useful tool in our toolbox for helping make our lives better. So thank you very much. I hope this was a useful talk, and I'm sure there are going to be some really fascinating talks following this one. So I'm looking forward to the rest of the day. Thank you very much, and have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks to Daniel for that basic introduction. I'm sure there's a lot more to be said, but hopefully he gave you some understanding of it. Now we've got Anmol, who is, I think, coming in live from Cambridge. And Anmol works with Alistair Denniston. And he's going to, I think, delve into a little bit more of the detail of the medical applications, the pitfalls and the difficulties in healthcare. So over to you, Anmol, and thank you very much for your contribution to the meeting.
Thank you very much, Dr. Situnayake, for inviting me, and it's a real honor to follow that talk from Daniel as well. So, hi everyone, I'm Anmol. I'm an academic foundation doctor based in Cambridge, and I'm here to give a quick talk about our research looking at AI in ophthalmology, based out of University Hospitals Birmingham with Professor Denniston, as you said, and based out of Moorfields Eye Hospital in London. Now, we've heard a definition of artificial intelligence in the last talk, and I completely agree with Daniel that it is difficult to define AI. And actually, I feel like everyone has their own definition, really. And the definition that I prefer to use is the concept that artificial intelligence is the ability of a computer system to perform tasks we usually associate with requiring human intelligence. And that's very similar to what Daniel said. In my mind, I distill that down into 3 key points: learning, reasoning, and self-correction. And the idea is simple, that if we were to expose an algorithm to a large data set, then it should be able to learn and reason in order to derive its own conclusions. So if we were to expose it to that data set of hot and cold images, it should be able to learn and reason to define conclusions as to whether a new image is hot or cold. The key point here is self-correction. The idea being that AI algorithms should be able to learn from their own mistakes. That learning and reasoning process should be automated, because it wouldn't make sense for us to constantly be interrupting and making changes whenever an algorithm makes mistakes. There wouldn't be any real time-saving benefit there. So all 3 of these are equally important, although the self-correction is more equally important. And of course, there's a massive range of use cases in AI in healthcare, and it's growing every day as well. The ones we usually hear about are computer-aided diagnosis and predictive medicine on the left-hand side here. But it's also important to recognize that there are behind-the-scenes uses that might end up being implemented even sooner, and that can have a huge benefit to the NHS. And there I'm talking about things like bed allocation or simulations for medical education, even things like automated drug creation using AI to predict novel drug targets. That's a real emerging area of research. Okay, so that's all for my introduction. I want to start with a real-world example now. And as I said, the partnership between Birmingham and Moorfields is focused on AI in ophthalmology, analyzing fundus photos like the ones you see on this screen. So this is a retinal fundus photo. It's a photo of the back of someone's eye. And if you've ever been to Specsavers, I'm sure you'll have had one of these taken. Now I can safely tell you that the fundus photo on this screen is normal. I know that because I picked the photo from Wikipedia. Now a trained consultant ophthalmologist would probably be able to go even further. As well as telling you that the photo is normal, they'd probably be able to say that this lighter pigmentation around the vessels and this darker pigmentation here, it might indicate that the person this photo belongs to is a relatively young person. And if there were pathology in this photo, we would be able to pick it up. Things like retinopathy or glaucoma or papilledema. And considering that this is actually a very simple, cheap, and easy test that only takes a few seconds to perform, that's quite a lot of information that a human ophthalmologist might be able to get out of this photo. But I don't need to be in the room to guess that you're probably not very impressed by that. That's completely fair enough. But what if I were able to tell you that if we exposed an AI algorithm to this same photo, this cheap, quick, and easy photo, that we'd be able to get information like age, sex, blood pressure, cardiovascular risk, or even risk of dementia. And now I'm hoping that that is impressive because that's the current frontier of AI research in healthcare. And that's the idea of oculomics. So oculomics is the idea that we can get an insight into systemic disease through imaging of just the eye. The idea being that if we use things like fundus photos, simple imaging, that we can look beyond eye disease and start to look at cardiovascular disease or neurological disease. Now, this broad idea that eyes are a window into the soul or a window into a wider health has been around for a long time. But it's only in the past couple of years with developments in AI that Professor Denniston and the team here in Birmingham coined that term oculomics. And it all culminated this year, really, with the paper at the very bottom here, a foundational model for generalizable disease detection from retinal images. And I won't go into the technical detail of the paper, but just for a high-level overview, the model was called RetFound. It's a huge AI model trained on publicly available datasets, as well as data from Moorfields Eye Hospital, linked to people's medical records so we can see their systemic diseases as well as their eye problems. And we're looking for three things. Of course, we want to be able to diagnose eye disease from eye photos, ocular disease diagnosis. That's the benchmark. We need to be able to do that for it to be used in ophthalmology. The next step, which is actually quite impressive, is looking at prognosis or progression of disease, trying to predict that from simple eye photos. And then the part that got the headlines was oculomics, trying to predict systemic disease from simple eye photos. Things like stroke, risk of heart attacks, or even Parkinson's disease. Now, this all sounds revolutionary and life-saving, I hope, when I describe it like that. But before everyone rings Specsavers and tries to get a fundus photo booked in, just be aware that it'll be a while before this is widely implemented at scale. And just linking it back to Daniel's talk, we're going from the peak of inflated expectations all the way down to the trough of disillusionment here on the Gartner hype cycle, because there are lots of different barriers to adoption of AI in healthcare. And these are by no means specific to the NHS. In fact, the NHS is probably ahead of the curve when it comes to promoting AI. Now, every one of these barriers is a presentation of themselves, so I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on them. The only one I really want to pick up on now is stakeholder involvement. Because it's very well characterized that for any innovation to be implemented in healthcare, it needs to be acceptable to all the major stakeholders involved. Of course, it needs to be purchased by healthcare organizations. In the UK, that would be talking about hospitals. In America, we might also be extending that to insurance companies and accountable care organizations. Naturally, it needs to be regulated by the state. Especially in a publicly funded healthcare system, it needs to be approved and acceptable by the state who would be funding it ultimately. Academia or industry tend to be the people who are developing these innovations, and they, of course, need to be on board for it to be actually used in the real world. In this case, we're talking about an innovation that's being created by academia, that Moorfields Birmingham partnership, but it could well be another innovation being created by a drug company, for example. Now, perhaps the most important and final stakeholder is the public. If anything's going to be implemented in the NHS, the public have the final say, really, on what they'd be willing or wouldn't be willing to use, especially considering that the organisation and the state themselves are directly accountable to the public. So if the public aren't on board, if charities aren't on board, if patient involvement groups aren't on board, none of this will ever be implemented. And that's why public and patient involvement is paramount to all of this AI research. And both Moorfields and Birmingham are really leading the front there in terms of involving patients. Of course, there is a need to ensure safety beyond those barriers. This is a very new challenge to regulators, because I mentioned at the start that AI incorporates those elements of learning, reasoning, and self-correction. Now, those aren't one-off things when you develop the algorithm. They're constant processes along the life cycle of an algorithm. Normally, when we talk about medical devices, they'll be tested in a lab environment, tested on people, and at some point they'll be marked as, yes, this is safe to use, and they can be distributed. Now, with AI, these algorithms change progressively over time. We may implement it one day, but the algorithm changes within 2, 3, or 4 years. And it's really important to ensure that we're keeping up with those changes and we're constantly keeping an eye on their safety over time. And that's a real challenge because we can't just have static medical approval there. We need something that's continuously evolving and watching over. I'm coming to the end of the talk now, but I just wanted to draw attention to two of the big initiatives here at Birmingham. Standing Together is a really exciting project looking to develop standards for diversity in datasets. It's an international collaboration, including universities from across the world, as well as patients and publics from across the world, and companies like Google are involved as well. And there's a really exciting paper being published here looking at diversity in datasets and the standards we need to try and promote that. But that's been embargoed for a press release in the next couple of weeks, so I'm not sure I'm allowed to say very much about that one, but please do keep an eye out for it. And the second thing is building out research data infrastructure, and this is critical to AI implementation in the NHS. Daniel alluded to the fact that we need a lot of data to train algorithms. And in healthcare, that's particularly difficult because we need to make sure that that data is kept incredibly safe, secure, and private. But at the same time, we need the infrastructure that data might be able to be shared between researchers and between organizations so that everybody can be represented in the data sets that AI is trained on. So Birmingham and Moorfields have led the way in ophthalmology through developing this Insight Health Data Research Hub. And there are ongoing wider efforts to try and build out national data infrastructure as well. Okay, that's all I wanted to say, apart from thank you very much for listening. If anything I said caught your attention, I'd really recommend you checking out one or both of these lines of work. On the one hand, we've got RepFound and the novel technical work going on to try and build out cutting-edge algorithms that are at the top of healthcare innovation right now. And on the other side, we've got the implementation science, looking at how do we actually get this stuff implemented in the real world? What are the barriers to adoption we need to overcome? And Standing Together is a perfect example of looking at algorithmic bias there. So thank you very much for your time. There's been plenty of media coverage, and I'm hoping that you'll see some more of it soon. I'll stick around for any questions in the chat, but feel free to contact me later on by email or however else as well. My email's on the slide. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you, Dr. Anmol. We do have some opportunity for some live questions, actually. Is he still on Zoom? Or is he gone? Oh, he's there. There we are. He's back. So we do have an opportunity for some live questions if anybody has got anything in the room. Yeah, okay.
Anmol, thank you very much for that first, that fantastic talk of yours. And can I ask you the first question, which really relates to the RepFound paper in Nature that was published, which was, I thought, a fantastic paper. One of the things that I'd like, if you could explain to us the concept of the AI and how you trained it, and it trained it, more or less trained itself using unlabeled data, and how that's a so-called foundation model, in other words, something that can be a sort of force for good across the globe. Could you explain that?
Yeah, absolutely. So foundational models are really quite difficult to make, actually, because they require huge amounts of data set. The idea being that if you've got enough data, you can pool it all together into one big model. As you say, it can be unlabeled data as well. And the AI algorithms can start to pick up patterns of their own accord within that data set. So coming back to Daniel's talk before, we saw hot and cold images were all labeled. So you train an algorithm on some hot images, on some cold images, and if you present a new one, it can try and predict which category it might fall into. Here we've got enough data that we can just pull it all together. The algorithm picks up on the patterns itself, and with some human assistance, admittedly, and some labeling, we can then get to some kind of predictions from it. Now, one of the key things here is it was trained on more than just one type of algorithm. One type of data. So I focused on retinal fundus photos because that's what we're most familiar with. That's what's most common. But actually, the algorithm was able to pick up OCT scans as well. So if you go to your Specsavers or Vision Express, they might offer enhanced imaging of your retina. And that's what these OCT scans are, and they're very common in ophthalmology. And the idea here is with more than one imaging modality, we're able to generate predictions. That's really actually quite novel. And I'm sorry I didn't focus on that too, but a lot of the foundational models we see in other domains really just pick up on one imaging modality. This specific ability to pick up on more than one is really important here. Of course, in terms of the development and testing, we can't just train it all on our own data and test it on our own data. And that's why there were so many different data sets used here, as well as the Moorfields Eye Hospital data, which was used for the majority of training. There were publicly available data sets, and UK Biobank was used as an external validator. So I hope that's a little bit more of an overview. I wasn't sure how specific to go in terms of the detail during the presentation, but I'm glad someone asked about it.
That was fantastic, and I thought the other great thing that the team did was to allow their foundation database resource to be available for the public good, so that other AI teams can use that too, which obviously is a great example for how we should share our data and learning. So that's wonderful. Are there any other questions in the room for Anmol? No. Okay, well, that's fantastic. Thank you very much for helping us out at the last minute, and you did fantastically well. Thank you very much. Have a good day.
Okay, so for those of you that are in the room, we're now going to have some lunch, so please do help yourself, take a break. There are some breakout areas if you want to sort of go to there, or you can bring it back to your table, and just aim to be back in the room seated by about 20 to 2. And for those online, please take a break. Remember to join using the afternoon link, so that should have been sent to you in an email. You might have had a reminder in the last hour as well, because it's a different link to join the afternoon sessions. And we'll see you back again about 20 to 2. All right, so go and enjoy, mix.